All right, let's get into this. We're going to take a look at a really controversial military paper from 1980. It was written to shake things up inside the U.S. Army. But oh boy, it ended up taking on a whole life of its own and became this huge internet legend. We are talking about MindWar.
And that quote, that's from one of the guys who actually wrote it, years later, just kind of marveling at what his paper turned into. You see, as soon as this document found its way onto the early internet, that title, MindWar, was all anyone needed to see. It was instantly seen as this top-secret government plot for mass mind control. But you have to wonder,
What did it really say? You know, if we peel back all those layers of conspiracy theory that have built up over the decades, what was the actual idea behind this thing? Well, that's exactly what we're going to break down. Okay, so to really get what MindWar was all about, you have to understand the mood right after the Vietnam War. For the folks in the U.S. military psychological operations units, PSYOP for short, there was this deep feeling that something had gone fundamentally wrong. Not on the battlefield, but in the war for public opinion, the war for hearts and minds.
so this is where it all started. The whole idea for MindWar came from inside the 7th PSYOP group. Back in 1980, the commander gave one of his officers, a Major Michael Aquino, a task. Write a paper that wasn't just another boring history report. He wanted something new, something radical, that would really force the military to think differently.
In this slide, this gets right to the core of it. The paper made this incredibly bold claim. America didn't lose in Vietnam because of military failure. It lost because its will to win was defeated. The argument was that the enemy was way more effective at eroding public support back home in the U.S. The war was lost in America, not in Vietnam. But here's the crazy part. On the ground in Vietnam, a lot of the tactical PSYOP stuff, like dropping leaflets, radio broadcasts, it was actually working. This number, over 29,000, that's how many enemy soldiers surrendered in just a 2-year period because of one of these programs. So you had these small wins, but they couldn't overcome the massive strategic loss of the war back home. And the authors of MindWar thought, we need a complete overhaul.
And that overhaul was MindWar. The paper argued they should just throw out the term psychological operations altogether. They thought it sounded weak, almost apologetic. They wanted a name that was, and I'm quoting them here, harsh and fear-inspiring.
And this is the definition they came up with. Let's really look at it. Deliberate, aggressive, convincing. This isn't passive. It's about proactively forcing a belief. And notice who they're targeting. All participants. That doesn't just mean the enemy. It means everyone.
This table really lays out just how huge of a change this was. Traditional PSYOP, that was always an add-on, a force multiplier that came in after the big decisions were already made. But MindWar, it was designed to be the main strategy that every single military action would serve. And get this, while PSYOP was often seen as propaganda, MindWar insisted on using truth. And maybe the biggest shift of all, PSYOP was legally barred from targeting Americans. MindWar aimed to target the entire world, including the U.S. domestic population.
So yeah, this is the key takeaway. MindWar wasn't a side gig, it was the whole show. Every single military decision, from dropping a bomb to moving troops, would be judged first by its psychological effect. The ultimate goal wasn't just winning a battle, it was to create this powerful global belief that an American victory was absolutely inevitable. So, how are they planning to actually do this? What tools and tactics were they proposing for this war of the mind? This is where the paper really starts to veer from military strategy into some pretty strange territory. First up, this idea of truth. They weren't talking about lies or deception. They were obsessed with using the truth. But it was a very aggressive kind of truth. The idea was to state a reality. For example, we are going to win, and then use every bit of national power to make that statement come true. So you're not just reporting on reality, you are literally creating it. The primary weapon to do this was supposed to be global media, television and radio blanketing the planet. To make that happen, the paper argued that the laws preventing the U.S. military from targeting its own citizens with propaganda had to be worked around. And then, in the footnotes, it gets even weirder, suggesting they could actually exploit natural phenomena to make people more open to their messages. And right here is where things go from unusual to just plain wild. The first footnote suggests monitoring things like sunspots or changes in the Earth's magnetic field. The theory here was that this kind of atmospheric activity can actually make people more receptive to new ideas, so you'd literally time your broadcast to coincide with sunspots. Next up, air ionization. The paper brought up research that suggested that having more negative ions in the air can make people feel more alert and excited, while positive ions can make them feel tired. So the idea was to figure out the ion situation in a target area to help craft the perfect psychological message. And for the grand finale, we have the most science fiction concept of them all: extremely low frequency waves, or ELF waves. The paper suggests that these waves, which happen in nature but can also be created artificially, could be used to subconsciously influence brain patterns, maybe making an entire audience more relaxed or passive without them having a clue what's happening. So, what on earth happened to this paper? Well, it wasn't adopted as official U.S. policy. It was at the end of the day just meant to start a conversation, but its story was far, far from over. Let's just quickly trace its journey. It gets written in 1980 to provoke debate. Then, in the 80s, it pops up on the early internet and just explodes in conspiracy theory circles. But then, fast forward to the Gulf Wars, and its co-author, Michael Aquino, starts noticing that while the whole MindWar package was never adopted, some of its core ideas were definitely being used.
And here's a perfect example: the whole practice of embedding journalists with military units. This became a huge thing during the Iraq War in 2003. Aquino pointed to this as a textbook, if partial, application of MindWar. Why? Because it's a way to directly manage and shape the media's perspective, which in turn shapes the public's perception back home, aligning it with what the military wants.
But here's the thing. Even the author himself gave a massive warning. He said the Achilles heel of these powerful techniques is that they have to be built on real ethical truth. Because if they're used to lie or manipulate, the backlash when people figure it out, what he called disintoxication, could be, in his words, socially shattering.
And that brings us to one last, really provocative question. When you look back at this paper from 1980, with its talk about total media dominance and shaping public opinion on the home front, you have to ask, in today's world of 24/7 information warfare, how many of its once radical ideas are now just considered standard operating procedure?